So thank you again, everyone, for coming to this week's Lockheed Martin Maryland Robotics Center seminar. Thanks again to Lockheed Martin for their continued support of this seminar series. So our speaker today is Professor Julie Adams. She is a professor and the associate director of the Collaborative Robotics and Intelligent Systems Institute at the Oregon State University. She was the founder of the Human-Machine Teaming Lab at Vanderbilt before she moved to Oregon State 5 years back. She's been working in the area of human-machine teaming for 30-ish years now. And she's worked sort of on many aspects of human-machine interaction, human-machine teaming, with a particular focus on unmanned system, both manned as well as military aircraft, with companies like Honeywell and Eastman Kodak. Her research is grounded in robotics applications for domains such as first response, archaeology, oceanography, airspace, US military, focusing on the human factors, artificial intelligence, swarming, robotics, and human-machine teaming. She received her MS and PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, where I was a postdoc, and her undergrad degree from Siena College. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Julie Adams, and I look forward to hearing what she has to say about her work on human collective teaming, specifically focusing on transparency and resilience of these human collective teams. Take it away.
Thank you. So as you may have heard in that introduction, I like to say I have a tertiary research personality. So I do robotics. Since I've moved to OSU, a lot more field robotics than I did at Vanderbilt. As well, I focus on the human factors aspects and on the artificial intelligence aspects. So a really kind of complex system aspect to my research. I've worked on human interaction for multi-robot systems since I was a grad student at Penn. And more recently, we've been focusing on collectives, which I'll define in a moment. I'm going to bookend this talk by talking first about some of the underlying algorithms without the human. And at the end, I'm going to talk about resilience results that we have that don't involve the human, but will have an implication on the human. And in the middle, I'll talk about some of the human interaction aspects. As was mentioned, we focus a lot in my group on first response, military domains, and disaster response. So we want our systems to be able to function in the real world and be able to be resilient and responsive. So why is this? Hold on one second. There we go. All right, now we're good. So a collective system in our context is really a very large system of very simplistic agents that is modeled after the biological inspirations. So we're not talking about a single robot system or even a multi-robot system in which you have a more expensive vehicle with more expensive, accurate sensors and high quality processors. We're typically talking about outdoor systems that average about $5,000 a piece, all inclusive of the processor, the equipment, the actuators, and the sensors. So that puts some limitations on what we can do. We don't have the computational capabilities that we would have in a single robot system or a multi-robot system. Additionally, for the domains we work in, we do not have access to the cloud. We do not have access to cellular coverage. So we really have to be focused on the local aspects of the system. So we take a lot of inspiration from our biological systems. We look at spatial swarms, so flocks of birds or schools of fish. These are distributed systems, often relying on implicit communication amongst the agents. The agents, there may be a few agents that have some particular piece of information, such as where is the source of food. And those agents are in the biological systems called leaders. And they are able to influence the overall spatial swarm to get to that particular food source so that the swarm can feed. Often, a number of the agents within the swarm are unaware of what they're actually attempting to achieve. They're simply responding to the local feedback that they're getting from their neighbors and making appropriate decisions and actions based upon that. So that is one aspect that we want to represent in our systems. We also focus on colony-based systems, so bees and ants, and these are a bit different than typical spatial swarms. So in colonies, we have a centralized communication hub at the nest. For honeybees, for example, they use their waggle dance to communicate with other honeybees. There are certain types of ants that do similar types of communications. And then there's also embedded communication in the environment, sigmergy, and for ants, the equivalent there is pheromone trails, although we do not consider pheromone trails in our work simply because of the domains that we consider. They're not necessarily viable for robotic systems. One of the unique aspects of colonies, though, is that the individual agents within the colony have jobs or roles that they perform, and those jobs and roles change over time as the individuals age through their life cycle. So this is an important aspect because it adds heterogeneity and responsibilities for tasks. And when we talk about spatial swarms or swarms in general, a lot of people assume that the swarm is homogeneous, but in fact, they really aren't. Even when we look at the biological systems, we see that within the same species, there's actually heterogeneity in the age or the size of the individuals that changes the types of things that they can do. We, in our work, use the term collective because we want to be developing systems that exhibit traits of spatial swarms as well as traits of colonies and the ability to move between the two because there's characteristics of each that are important for the broader types of missions that we're interested in. So one of the things about simulation for these large systems, and we're talking hundreds to thousands of entities within our systems, when you start talking about the simulators, they tend to be point-based. They have very low fidelity because once you add in the environmental physics and the physics of the agents themselves, it quickly becomes a situation where you are unable to scale the number of vehicles to very large numbers. So what we've been working on is developing this indoor test bed that you see on the left-hand side that allows us to transition from those point-based simulators to something that's more realistic as a step between moving to the outdoor environment. So what we have is a 13 by 15 foot platform that you see here. The white floor is actually a set of tiles that can be moved around, kind of like tile games. And the two orange sections that you see on the white are actually hubs. And so we have the ability for the agents to come to the hub and communicate. And we have 100 ground robots. An example of one of our ground robots is pictured on the upper right. And then we also incorporate the Crazy Fly UAS. One of the things you will not see in this picture is a motion capture system. And that is because we ultimately want to be able to transition our capabilities from indoor to outdoor. And most frequently in our domains, we're talking about being able to use GPS to localize when it's not jammed. But we need to have similar error. So for the vehicles that we use for our outdoor experiments, they're rather small. We have about a 5 to 7 meter error in our GPS readings. And we want something similar with our robots in this test bed. So we actually have adapted BitCraze's local positioning system, which is an ultra wideband localization system from the Crazy Fly to the ground robots. So we've developed our own board, but we worked with BitCraze. And they've also developed a board that now allows their local positioning system to be used on ground robots, but ours is significantly cheaper. And so we're using our board. So we are able to take our algorithms and put them into this system. This is an important step if we want to move to the outside world. I am a co-PI on the DARPA Offset Integrator team led by Raytheon BBN with our collaborators SmartFlow Information Flow Systems. The offset program's been ongoing for a few years. It will conclude later this year with our final field exercise this summer. And within this program, we are doing 4 to 6 hour missions with multiple mission phases that you have to be able to transition through. So there's objectives you have to achieve within each mission phase before you're allowed to advance to the next mission phase. We're doing this on a military base. So this next exercise will be at Joint Base Lewis McChord. And the CACTIF that we'll be using is an urban environment that covers about 8 city blocks with different types of buildings involved. In these types of domains, we don't have, like I said, the ability to communicate to the web outside of our local infrastructure. And we also have to accept the fact that oftentimes the vehicles are going to have to operate without communications back to a human supervisor. So we have a single human supervisor that is responsible for monitoring the swarm and influencing the swarm. Originally, we were planning to have 250 vehicles for the final field exercise, but due to COVID, we had to cancel our last field exercise. So we're now shooting for 150. The difficulty with trying to test such systems in real world environments, especially for UAS, as many as you know, we don't have the ability to fly them in any airspace. We have to be in a military airspace. And there's also a restriction on where you can actually get to reliably on a regular basis to test things. So Raytheon actually tests at Fort Devens in Massachusetts. So we have limited space and we can't really scale to the number of vehicles we want. The vehicles we've used in our prior field exercises are over here on the left-hand side. We have two types of ground robots. This picture is the Ion R1. We also have Ion R6s, basically a 6-wheel version. And we have these are indeed 3DR Solos, one of the best UAS, most reliable UAS we've ever flown. And then we have the VIFI EFOs that we've integrated into our system as well. So we flew these vehicles during our last field exercise almost a year ago. And as we move forward, we're going to be adding 3 additional vehicles to our fleet for the next field exercise in order for us to scale to the number of vehicles we need. So we're adding in the Vauxhall M500 multi-rotor, and then we're adding in the Talon Evo fixed wing, the smaller fixed wing right here that will be used for persistent surveillance. And then this fixed wing, I'm assuming you can see my cursor, so I'm hoping you can. The fixed wing on the far right on the bottom is Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory customized fixed wing UAS that can do building surveillance of outside buildings. The smaller UAS are going to be doing persistent surveillance at altitude. And then we also have to be able to accommodate both the ground and multi-rotor vehicles going from outdoor to indoor environments, so GPS to GPS denied areas. All of this is being monitored, like I said, by a single human supervisor. And we, of course, have a lot of autonomy and planning and such in this system. So it's very complex to deploy these systems. As you can imagine, there's lots of equipment and logistics that has to be addressed in addition to all the capabilities of the system that we need. So, you know, this leads us to that human collective teaming. And what do I actually mean by that term? So first of all, for the collective, we're talking about hundreds or thousands of individual entities. So if you have flown UAS, you know that currently you have to have visual line of sight. Well, we clearly don't have visual line of sight of these vehicles, and we can't even have a single human having line of sight to all these vehicles over the course of the interaction. So, you know, what we were talking about is having a single supervisor that is able to understand the autonomous capabilities of these vehicles, as well as the vehicles to be able to communicate to the human what they think is happening. As you can imagine, there's so many different aspects that have to go into developing these systems that go into the real world. I'm going to only talk about 3 of them. I'm going to talk a little bit about algorithms. I'm going to talk about the interaction and transparency into the system. And then I'm going to talk about resilience for these systems. Are there any questions before I go into the algorithms?
Not at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Actually, there is a question. Ben Schneiderman has a question.
Hi,
So I'm
Ben.
going to let him talk.
There we
Ben,
go.
you should be able to unmute
Thank you for the opening. And I see the ambition, and of course, the attraction of biomimicry is strong. On the other hand, I wonder about it in that bee swarms and colonies are not always friendly and under control. They behave in unpredictable ways. So you know, I'm looking forward to hearing how you think you can do better than beehives and better than bird swarms.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, Ben, and I won't necessarily be addressing that directly because there is a lot of uncertainty that can't be, handled, although that is an aspect that we're trying to address with some of the work we're doing in our algorithms, as well as some of the resilience work. But I won't be able to address that completely because that's really an open question within the field of robotic systems. So
Well, thank you. But I think, for military systems, the idea of commanders being in control is a very long established principle.
Yes, that is a well-established principle, not only for the military, but also for the FAA. So, there are questions of how does this get dealt with as we go forward? And there are no good answers to those questions right now. I can tell you that I'm on an advisory board for the Army, and that's one of the things that we are investigating for a report for the Army right now. So,
Thank you.
you're welcome. So we'll talk a little bit about algorithms. And as Ben mentioned, there's a lot of inspiration in these biological systems that we can take. And one of the important facets here that I alluded to is that these systems don't have the computational capabilities that we might have on a single robot system, or if we have access to cloud services or a centralized computational capability. These are decentralized systems. So, we're typically using for the 3DR solos, we're using Raspberry Pis. We're using Jetson processors on our other vehicles, which I will admit are much better than the computers I had when I was doing my dissertation, and that was a computer tower, but still quite simplistic compared to the processors we're used to in other scenarios. So we need to have algorithms that are really going to scale to these large numbers of vehicles, and they have to also be flexible and address these decentralized aspects. So over the course of the last 12 years or so, my group has worked on a number of these algorithms. We're going to spend time talking about the sequential best of n decision-making throughout the rest of this presentation. But I also want to point out some of our ongoing efforts. So we actually do work with the honeybee lab at Oregon State to conduct studies with honeybees, to understand some of those characteristics so that we can develop controllers for our robots. And this was done as a DARPA project with smart information flow technologies. So a lot of really interesting kind of cutting edge types of algorithms, but as Ben alluded to, we don't have the ability to fully verify and validate these algorithms. Another thing that I should be very clear about, these algorithms that I'm talking about here are not algorithms that incorporate machine learning. There is a lot of focus on doing deep learning and machine learning for robotics going forward, and I think that's an important aspect, but it's also important to recognize that autonomous systems and AI are also much broader than machine learning. So if we talk about the best of n consensus decision-making algorithms, right now we're in the springtime, you may see a group of bees hanging out on a branch just like this. And what that is it's a daughter colony that has left the primary colony with a queen to go establish a new colony. When they do this, a subset of those bees that you see, about 3%, are going out and they're searching the area for crevasses or places where they can establish a new hive. And what's really interesting is bees have a quite sophisticated measurement capability to identify the quality or utility or value, whichever term you would like to use, of a potential site. And what happens is the bees go out, they find the sites, they come back, and they're trying to recruit other scouts to go out and investigate their site. Eventually, they attain consensus as to what is the best site, or they should. Now, what can happen is you can end up with a split decision, meaning that perhaps two sites are chosen. And so some subset of this group of bees will go to one site and the other subset will go to the other. Well, there's only one queen. So that subset without the queen is going to end up dying off. And so you want to avoid that. So that's one thing you'd like to avoid. Another thing that happens with honeybees is there's this aspect of environmental bias that I'll talk quite a bit about, in which the best quality location for that new hive may be located fairly far away from where the bee's central location is, and they end up reaching consensus on a lower quality site because it's closer to the hive. So there's a number of aspects here that we want to try to mitigate from the natural systems. And if you're interested in the honeybees, I recommend Tom Seeley's Honeybee Democracy, which does a great job of describing this process. We're going to be trying to familiarize you here with some of the terminology we use. So the light gray circle here in the center is what I'm going to call the hub. And this is where the agents, the colored triangles here, are able to be interactive. So if it's a solid, it means that they're interacting with one another. They're not necessarily doing a waggle dance, but they're trying to recruit other individuals to go out and investigate their target. I should say that one of the algorithms that I'll be presenting, our algorithm that I'll refer to as the Cody algorithm, is not based just on honeybees, but also on some ant colonies who exhibit similar behaviors, but slightly different. The agents that are outside of the hub are hollow, and that means that they are not communicating with others, so they're latent. And we have two targets here. We have target A and we have target B. And you notice that target B is closer to the hub while target A is farther away. If target A is that higher value target, there is a possibility that if you aren't handling environmental bias, that target B that has a lower overall utility or value will be selected over target A because of that environmental bias I spoke about. The red agents are uncommitted. They do a random walk throughout the environment, similar to what ants and bees do in order to find the targets in some of our algorithms. Go forward. There we go. So when we began this work, Raina and colleagues had developed the state-of-the-art individual best of n consensus decision-making algorithm that I'm going to refer to as System R as we continue the talk. And what you see in this finite state diagram is the upper states here are the uncommitted states, meaning these agents are investigating the environment. They are looking for targets. They're trying, or they may be recruited to investigate a target if they haven't found one. Down in these lower states, the agents have identified a target that they're favoring, represented by I, and they can either be interactive or they can be latent. And then there's probabilistic transitions that occur. There are some limitations of this algorithm. One is that it does not address the environmental bias, and it, in fact, will select lower quality targets when the highest quality target is farther away. Additionally, consensus decision making in general is a slow process. So in our domain, where we're concerned about disaster response or military, we need to be making decisions on a fairly quick basis. So that's also a concern we want to be able to address algorithmically if we can. And then finally, this particular algorithm assumed that once a search was started, a decision-making process was started, that the hub knew where all the targets were. They didn't discover the targets. Additionally, this algorithm was unable to respond to dynamic aspects in the environment. So if a target goes away, for example. So my student, Jason Cody, wanted to address this issue. And so we developed what we're going to call System C here to address these factors. So one of the first things that Jason did with regard to Raina's algorithm was add in the capability to mitigate the effects of these lower value close targets receiving more interactions within the hub and potentially gaining consensus before a higher value target was identified farther away from the hub. So we added in these interaction delays through the blue shaded delay states that delayed the agents coming in from targets that were closer to the hub. So to minimize the impact that they could have on the overall interaction and communication and recruitment. But we also had a interaction frequency modulation that tried to also kind of even out that interaction aspect and recruitment to the different sites. What we found with this is that we did deal with the environmental bias in Jason's studies of comparing the two algorithms. We in fact received better results and were able to identify and select the highest value target more frequently than Raina's algorithm. The other aspect of this is because Jason is an active duty Army soldier and he's currently a faculty member at West Point, he was very interested in not just a one-off decision, but how do we use this for kind of sequential decisions so that we go out and we investigate an area, we select an area, we move the hub to that location and then begin a new search area. We are assuming, just like with honeybees, that we're limited in the radius that we can search, and in everything I'm going to talk about today, we assume that the agents can go out to 500 meters from the hub. So we start out with this sequential process, if you will, that the agents are deliberating, once they find that there is a quorum favoring a site, they can commit to that. And then the committed robots, they need to enter into this initiate state where they're trying to communicate, yes, we've made a decision, we're all going to move to this particular location. With the honeybees, the scout agents will actually activate the rest of the bees that are resting to have them be guided to the new location. Once the initiation is done, the hive will move to that new location. I should state in everything that I'm going to present today, because we assume that the communication is being done in the hub, there will inevitably be agents that are outside of the hub when the decision to initiate the move to the location and the execution is done. So they will not obtain that information, and we will lose agents as we move throughout the decision-making process, but it doesn't have a large impact on our results. After they've completed moving to that new target location, then they've completed that decision and they start a new process again by going out and just searching to identify targets. So we don't know where the targets are when we begin the process. In these cases, what we're doing for all these decisions is we have, each agent has a queue in order to be able to detect that quorum or the interactions with the committed agents. So we have two types of queues. We have a persistent queue where the queue does not get flushed from the time we start a new decision-making process until that decision-making process is completed. And then we also use episodic queues that will be cleared out as we transition between these different states. Oops, forgot about that one. So in understanding these algorithms, we were able to improve not only on the biological inspiration, but also on what was the state of the art by minimizing the effects of environmental bias, which was really important. We were also able to introduce this ability to have sequential decisions and also the dynamic aspects of the environment. So being able to dynamically identify targets as well as, you'll see, remove targets. And then with the persistent queues, these were really more reliable when we had very noisy quorum conditions. So I talked about that split decision where perhaps there's multiple targets that are getting a lot of feedback and a lot of consensus. So the persistent queue can mitigate that and reduce the likelihood of a split decision. However, it still takes a long time. And so the episodic queues, when we use strong filtering, actually were faster and more accurate in making the decisions. So this is the algorithm aspect, but there's still some limitations here. The consensus decision-making process can still take too long, even though we were able to shorten that with certain types of queues. And these algorithms didn't provide ability for a human supervisor to influence them. There's been a lot of work in the swarms, human swarm interaction of how do you influence this overall swarm when you can't directly communicate with every single individual. And with colonies, there had been no work on how to do that. So that's what we're going to talk about next, but I want to pause for a moment to see if there's any questions.
There's a question here in the chat from Kulbir Ahluwalia. He's asking if the new hive is closer to the parent hive, wouldn't they become competitors for resources in that area? Shouldn't the bees choose the hive that's further away to reduce the competition, I suppose?
So there is no, so honeybees, if you look at the honeybee literature, they don't really have a notion of the competitiveness. And they will just choose, they will develop consensus for whatever site they think is the best site of what they're perceiving. Now, the swarm of bees does go a distance from the prior hive before they begin their search, but they don't naturally mitigate for being too close to another hive. In our case, we do not have adversarial, the hubs of agents are not competing with each other. So we're assuming that they're all friendly agents and there's no kind of competitiveness, although you do see a little bit of it with some targets, as we'll see in a moment. Anything else?
Not at the moment.
All right, thank you. All right. So let's transition now to talking about the human aspects of these things. So with Jason's work, we really wanted to understand the models and the differences between the models and His work just with the algorithms themselves demonstrated that his algorithm performed better than Rayna's algorithm and resulted in the highest value target being selected more frequently with statistically significant results. But we also wanted to look at what happens when the human influences these systems and how can the human influence these systems. So we developed an abstract interface. Most of the human swarm interfaces that you will see will show every single individual. And from a human factors perspective, that can lead to a lot of visual clutter, a lot of confusion, et cetera, as you'll see when I show you a video in a moment. So we developed this abstract interface that I'll describe in a second. But his study really focused on comparing Rayna's algorithm, system R, to his algorithm, system C, with a human-driven model. And in the human-driven model, this is really fundamentally the human making all the decisions. So the human was selecting which targets the agents were to investigate, was selecting which targets to not investigate, and selecting when the decision should be made. So we have 3 high-level basic commands that the operator can provide across all 3 of these models. So we have the ability to tell the hub that it should investigate a target. So you select a hub, you select the target, and you commit that command, and 5% of the agents in the hub will go investigate that target. Excuse me. We also have an abandon command, which means that you select the hub, you select the target, and you're basically telling that hub to no longer investigate that target. If there are agents that are going out to investigate that target, then they will not find that target. And when they determine that the target is not there, they revert to an uncommitted state and start doing a random walk exploration. And then finally, there is the decide command, which can be issued once 50% of the agents have reached consensus for a target. And the human can just tell the hub, you have to make the decision now. So that causes the hub to start making that decision to make that transition. In these studies that I'm going to talk about, we have 2 types of targets. We have easy targets, those that are closer to the hub, and we have targets that are, the highest value target is hard, meaning that it's more than 350 meters from the hub. We also present the results of overall decision difficulty. So you see a portion of the abstract interface here. In these studies, we have 4 hubs, and you'll see this in the video I'll show you in a moment. Each hub has 200 agents at the start, and they are able to investigate any number of targets within a 500-meter range. When they start a decision-making problem, they don't know where any of the targets are. They have to do the random walk to find the targets and then recruit the other agents from their hub to that target. Now, it is possible, and I'll show you an example of this in a moment, that, for example, this target here could be shared by another hub, say over here to the left, and both hubs can be investigating it. One of the features of this type of problem is that within the set of hubs or targets that are available to a hub, they're looking for the highest value target. In this case, the target here would be, the highest value target is 4, and we know this by the darkness of the green, which represents the value. So this target here, 5, is a lower value target. And so in most cases, we don't have targets that are going to have the same highest value for 2 different hubs. That could occur though. So there would be a little bit of competition there, and it's more about which hub makes the decision first. Whichever hub makes the decision first gets that target. So the hubs are represented by the Roman numeral rectangles here. You see the uncommitted, favoring, committed, and executing state. And the darkness of the white indicates how many agents are in that particular state. So the majority of the hub's agents are now in this execute state. Oh, my mouse froze. There we go. And when we want to be able to visualize that execution, so this empty rectangle with the green outline is actually moving to the target to show that the hub is moving to this location to take that target, and then we'll begin a new search. My most recent PhD student, Karina Roundtree, is more of a human factors student. So she was really interested in how the visualizations influence the human collective team performance, and how do we address transparency from this very complex system where we can't have complete, accurate information. So she looked at the individual agents, which I'll explain this picture in a moment, and used Jason's algorithm because we had established that his algorithm performed better than Raina's, and the human-driven model that we talked about before. She had the same sets of targets with easy and hard decisions, and we had the same interactions of being able to specify a target to investigate, a target to abandon, and the hub to make a decision. One of the things I forgot to mention is that both experiments allowed the operator to cancel the abandonment of a particular target. So if you had abandoned a target, you could select that target and cancel and allow it to be back into the decision-making process. So this interface that she developed, which was the individual agents interface, is much more representative of what we see in the traditional human swarm interaction literature. So you see each of the individual agents here, roughly, I don't know that we're seeing all 200 of them because this is a sub shot, but the yellow agents are those that are uncommitted and they're just exploring the space. The green agents are favoring this particular target, 15 here. The hub is here with the Roman numeral. The white does not mean anything, it's just the hub. And then when the agents are going to be moving to a new target, they turn a cyan color. We do for the oh, my mouse is stuck, there we go. For the targets, the darker green does represent the value. So 15 has a higher value than say target 12. So I'm going to show you some video here and hopefully they're going to play well since I'm experiencing some delays. So you see both interfaces happening at the same time. These are two different participants. This is partway through an experiment, so we've already discovered the targets. The little yellow dot is just showing you where the human is doing interactions to make it easier for you to see. And so you do see some information boxes showing up for the targets. Those boxes are indicating which hubs are, what percentage of agents in each hub are favoring a particular target. What you see up here on the upper right side is that this target was selected, the hub was moved, and now you see that they're starting to do the random walk from here. We're going to start to see this one move to here as well. And you can see on the left-hand side that this hub is now moving to this target. So you get a general idea of what's happening. There are at least two decisions per all four hubs in a trial. So there are at least 8 decisions total. Sometimes there can be more given the time of the trials. It just kind of depends on some of the factors of how the humans interacted with the system. So another aspect of this is, we've got this very complex system and we're sending it out into this environment where we aren't going to have perfect communications with it. We are going to have, as Ben alluded to, algorithms that maybe are not going to make the right decisions or the best decisions. So how do we allow the human to know what's going on in these complex environments? So this notion of transparency is one way to address that. And even though I'm talking about the inability to get all this information, I do want to be clear about one thing. In the experimental results that I'm going to talk about for the human subjects experiments, we did assume perfect communications to the hub, but transparency has to also consider the fact that you aren't going to have that perfect communication in the real world, which is what we see. So Jessie Chen and her colleagues at the Army Research Lab developed this concept of agent transparency, which is really a representation of the quality of the information that an agent is providing to the human with regard to the agent itself. So the intent is to support the operator's comprehension and allow the human to be able to better interact with the agent that they're looking at. As part of their work, they developed this situation awareness agent transparency framework. And this framework leverages 3 important elements. So it leverages Lee's and colleagues' operator trust calibration model with the 3 Ps, purpose, process, and performance. it leverages Micah Ensley and colleagues' situation awareness model, and it leverages Rao and colleagues' belief, desires, intention framework. And if you look at the 3 levels that they incorporated into the framework, and you're familiar with Ensley's situation awareness model, you'll notice that there's a lot of parallels between the 2. However, rather than focusing on the human's awareness here, we're focusing on the agent's awareness and ability to communicate that to the human. So level 1 is really this low level, can the agent actually understand what its status is, what it's perceiving, and be able to communicate that to the human. Level 2 is, can the agent reason about how it's processing that information, what the potential constraints are in the environment, and how that's affecting its reasoning processes and the perceptions that it's getting, and how that might influence the human's comprehension of what the agent is doing. I avoided saying explainability because to me, explainability or explainable AI is a component of this level 2, but it's not the entire equation here. And then level 3 is the agent's perception of what it's going to do in the future. Is it going to be able to attain its goals? What are some of the potential uncertainties that it's running into? So Chen and colleagues developed this framework for a single agent, and then they extended it to multi-agents. But our work really focused with Karina on how do we extend this to collective systems. And this is work that I've been doing with my colleague, Mike Goodrich from Brigham Young. So how do we take transparency and define it within collectives? And because we're already running out of time, I don't have time to go into all of those aspects, but I have provided at the bottom here a citation to Karina's article that talks about that framework for collectives. So Karina's really interested in the transparency aspects, and we did 2 different types of visualization, or 2 types of analyses, sorry. The first analysis is this visualization analysis, where we use just the data related from the human subject studies on the Cody algorithm, System C, comparing the collective visualization to the individual agents for the easy and hard decisions. This is a pretty typical kind of human systems interaction analysis that we would see. We developed 4 research questions and 8 hypotheses. I can't talk about all of them, so I'm going to pick on 2 of them. So we're going to talk a little bit about usability. So the hypothesis was that the collective visualization would promote better usability, and then also performance of the team. And so we predicted that the collective visualization would perform better than the individual agent's interface. We had over 28 metrics that we were looking at. This is also an open question with regard to transparency. So rather than measuring things like specific usability questions or workload, how do you actually assess transparency? And it's much more complex. We're not going to talk about all those either. We're going to talk about 2 specific metrics that I'll define as we go forward here with regard to the research questions. So the highest value target abandoned percentage is looking at how many times the human instructed a hub to abandon what was in fact the highest value target, divided by the total number of targets abandoned. And our hypothesis was that that percentage would be lower. There'd be fewer highest value targets abandoned for the collective interface. Well, we didn't find that. And in fact, with the Cody algorithm, making the decisions with some of the human influence, we found that the individual agents had a slightly lower, although not statistically significant, percentage of rejecting those or abandoning those higher value targets, sorry, not rejecting. So that means that we did not support our hypothesis that the collective visualization would promote better usability for this particular aspect of usability. This is not all aspects of usability. As far as performance is concerned, we wanted to look at the selection success rate, which again is a percentage of the decisions that were made and how frequently we selected the highest value target. So if we look at that, we actually see that we get we get better results for the collective, for the selection success rate. And it is significant for the overall and the hard decisions, but was not significant for the easy decisions. So we do support our hypothesis generally that the collective visualization provided better performance as far as this particular factor was concerned with regard to performance of achieving higher selection success rates. It's not surprising with the hard decisions that we receive or that we obtain a lower success rate, even though we are mitigating for environmental bias. They're just harder decisions to make. Now, what's interesting here that this analysis, this simplistic analysis does not give us is that the collective interface resulted in a higher number of the highest value targets being abandoned, but we had a better selection success rate, meaning we selected the highest value targets. So how did that happen? This analysis doesn't really tell us that. There's obviously something going on. So what we were able to kind of determine by scratching the surface was that the ability for the operators to cancel that negative influence, if you will, on the collective really resulted in that performance being better and that selection accuracy being higher. So a limitation here is that we don't have the broader transparency factors considered of how are the interactions really influencing this outcome, and what are the different factors not only of the algorithm but also of the interface that impact that. So we went further with our analysis as a more complex analysis that many often avoid in the human systems interaction domain of looking at a lot of different combinations. So the system driven model against the human driven model, along with the interfaces and the decision difficulty. We have very similar 4 research questions and 8 hypotheses. These are effectively the same hypotheses with the addition that Cody's algorithm with the collective visualization will be better than the individual agents interface or anything with the human-driven model. Excuse me. So again, we have the highest value target abandonment rates. We want to look over here on the right-hand side where we have the human-driven data. And so you can see I've highlighted here that the lowest percentage of abandoning the highest value target is with the individual interface for the human driven. So this is where the human is very involved in the decision making and kind of really directing the colony to get through this process, which is a pretty good result considering they're managing 4 colonies of 200 agents and about approximately 16 targets simultaneously. But we also see with the collective interface that we have a very low, if you will, high target abandonment rate. And in fact, it's almost identical between the 2 interfaces for the easy decisions, and overall is fairly identical, but we see a broader delta for the hard targets. There is no significant difference between these 2. But what we do notice when we compare this to the prior results for Cody's algorithm is that we're much lower than when we're using the autonomous algorithm. And that's not surprising because the human's more involved. However, we don't support our hypothesis that the system-driven model with the collective visualization is better. Excuse me. So here we're seeing the selection success rate for the human-driven model. And we note that it is slightly better for the human-driven collective visualization combination compared to Cody's algorithm with the collective visualization. But this is not significantly different between these 2, but we do see an improvement. For the individual agents display, we really don't see any change at all between Cody's algorithm and the human-driven. So we do have partial support for our hypothesis here that Cody's algorithm with the collective visualization will result in a higher selection success rate. And then what we want to really look at, though, is this relationship. So as we noted on the prior slide, excuse me, that the human-driven collective visualization resulted in a lower abandonment of the highest value target. So we have the low abandonment that we expected with the high selection accuracy, but we are still able to get this high selection accuracy with the algorithm, even though the high value targets were abandoned. So we're starting to see some of these relationships in the interface, and that cancel command really made a difference for the operators. So when we look at this in more depth, we find that this result we saw previously, in which we were really abandoning a high number of these targets, really isn't necessarily due to the visualization, it's due to some of the other aspects of the system. So what we can take away from this is that, we really have to look at transparency as these confluence. So we have over, I think, 30 or 40 factors that make up the concept of transparency for collectives. And it's the interrelationships of these factors that we have to be looking at in our analyses, which makes the statistical analysis and the experimental design significantly more complex. We also have to figure out how to quantify using objective metrics of transparency, which has been a big issue for me. I like to avoid subjective metrics. And then we also want to recognize that undesirable behaviors from poor transparency may not actually cause a negative effect for the teaming. We could get a good result from that. So before I go on to resilience, I want to ask if there's any questions.
Yes, there's a question from Ben asking, your visual user interface admirably shows the current state. Have you considered showing a future status display that would show the operator what will happen in 10 or 60 seconds so they can intervene to guide it?
Excellent question, Ben. And in fact, that is the focus of a new grant that just started from So we've been developing some different variants of the best event algorithm that will allow us to have some predictive capabilities. And we literally just had our kickoff meeting 2 days ago. So we're at the start of this, but we're really intending to provide that predictive capability in the visualizations as well, and seeing how that impacts everything. So ask me in about a year what our results are. Other questions?
Not at the moment.
Great. So I want to move on to the concept of resilience, because even though we now have these algorithms, we have the ability for the human to influence these algorithms, and we have this notion of transparency that we're starting to create to give the human insight into this more complex system, especially in these real world environments where we don't have perfect communications and perfect information. We need to also think about, how do we create algorithms that can withstand disturbances in the environment? Because when you're talking about first response or military, you've got these uncertain dynamic domains. And so the system has to be responsive. Going back to our biological inspiration, we see that, biological systems, particularly swarms and collectives, are highly resilient in many cases. So they are often, you often can go on Google and find videos, for example, of fish swarms avoiding sharks, and doing so very nicely in an elaborate patterns, and looking very intelligent while doing that. So they have some capacity to resist the impact of the perturbation in their environment. They are often able to absorb and recover from that disruption. As well, they have capacity to learn about disturbances that they hadn't encountered before and be able to improve their performance. So this is something that we need to think about within the context of our collectives, because, if you've ever done field robotics, if it's going to go wrong, anything can go wrong, and it does. And the autonomy will fail. The sun is going to be at just the right angle to mess up your camera so it doesn't see the curb and your robot flips over, or any number of things that go wrong. So we need to be able to build resilience into our systems. And one of our current ONR projects, this is an effort, again, with Mike Goodrich at BYU, but also Matthias Schotz at Tufts. And I think I said this, but I'm not quite sure what I just said a moment ago. So this is an ONR sponsored project through the Science of AI program. We are investigating, how do we develop and define resilience for robotic systems? So not only single agent systems and multi-robot systems, but also the collectives, which is my primary focus. If you look at the literature on resilience, there's two predominant types: engineering resilience, which seeks to have kind of a steady state. And when a disturbance happens, you're going to fall below that steady state, and you're trying to reduce that delta that you fall, but also the time that you are below that steady state, and you're trying to go back and achieve that target performance level you had prior to the disturbance. And then ecological resilience seeks to have the system maintain a steady state, but there's a threshold over which you can't cross without changing the system dynamics. So the example I like to use here is something like a levee breaking. So the system dynamics are completely altered. And so you want to keep that water from eating away at the levee in order to maintain that system. Now, the majority of the literature in both of these areas is post hoc analysis, but we want to have a framework that's going to allow the system to understand what the current situation is and how to respond resiliently. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our current results. So as part of this work, we've defined classes of perturbations. One perturbation class that we define is adding information or control capabilities. So this should, in theory, be a good thing. You could imagine adding a new actuator, or perhaps a new agent comes in with a new capability that wasn't there before that changes how the task needs to be done. So this should, in theory, be a good thing, but in some of our studies, and I'm not going to talk about those particular results because we don't have time, but we've seen that adding agents can be bad, for example. Ablation is where you might lose information completely. A sensor just blows out. It's no longer any good. Or you've lost an actuator. Or in the case of the best of N, which we'll talk about in a moment, we've lost one of our targets that we knew about. We've also defined distortion. So you've got sensor noise, so you're not properly perceiving that environment, for example. Or perhaps your actuator is not at full functionality, or any other types of things that might distort aspects of the environment. And then a shift is a combination of these different types of addition, ablation, and distortion perturbations that are much more complex. So we're investigating all of these different types of perturbations, and my current student, Jennifer Leaf, has a paper coming out in the Swarm Symposium in a couple of months that looks at results for the addition and ablation perturbations. So if we go back to our best of N scenario here, our hub is in the center where you see the quad. We have 3 targets, the highest value target being 90. And we are going to remove that target. We're just going to destroy it. So we are trying to reach consensus for that highest value target. And we have some agents that are favoring that target. And we want to understand, how is that algorithm going to respond if we remove that highest value target? What we want to have happen is that that algorithm, or that consensus decision, is going to result in choosing the highest value target, which is 85. So as part of Jennifer's research, we've done some experiments both with Rayna's algorithm and with Cody's algorithm. And you can see the independent variables for these experiments that she's run. So we varied the number of agents from 50 to 500. And on the charts I'm going to show, that'll be your x-axis. We had 4 targets with a value of, one target was value 60, another target was 70, 80, and 90, so 90 being the highest. And then we have 7 different configurations of the targets, where the targets were either easy, close to the hub, the highest value target was easy, closest to the hub, or kind of in an intermediate range, or in that 400 to 500 range, which is considered difficult. The targets were located at 3, 6, 9, and 12 o'clock for all of the evaluations. This is a simulation-based evaluation, just reiterating there's no human here. And for each of the combinations, there were 50 trials run. She did both add agents perturbation as well as the ablation of removing the site. We're only going to talk about removing the site. We are very interested in the disturbance timing. We expect that if we can introduce the disturbance by at least halfway through the consensus decision-making process, that the algorithm should be able to respond and make fairly good decisions of choosing the second highest target as the target to select. So in our case for these evaluations, the consensus threshold is 75%. So halfway through that is the 35% that you see for the disturbance timing. Obviously 15 is early in the process, and then 60 and 72 are late in the decision-making process. Our dependent variable that we're going to talk about is that selection accuracy percentage that I've been talking about, where in this case, we're talking about it being the second highest target being the accurate selection because we've ablated the target of 90. We've removed it partway through that decision-making process. So what you see here on the left-hand side are the results with Rayna's algorithm. Now recall that Rayna's algorithm does not deal with environmental bias. So the black lines here are baseline, meaning that the 90 target, the highest value target, is not ablated. We're doing 50 trials and for all the different target configurations. And you can see that for the easy target, the solid line, it's quite good, especially as we increase the number of agents along the x-axis. So our y-axis here is the selection accuracy. For the intermediate problems, it gets better as we get more agents. And for the difficult problems, it actually gets worse for 500 agents, but it's pretty stable, but still very low. The reason we see this separation is because it's not accounting for that environmental bias. What we see when we look at the disturbance timings for the easy problems, there's not a lot of difference here. It doesn't really matter when we introduce the disturbance, but we see some additional differences for the intermediate and difficult problems. And what's interesting is the cyan line here, which is the 15% introduction of the disturbance, is actually the worst for both the intermediate and the hard problems. When we look at the same analysis with Cody's algorithm that deals with that environmental bias, note that our baseline conditions, the black lines, are all right up here at the top. And if we look at 500 agents over here on the far right, for the easy to difficult problems, we're about 80 to 90% selection accuracy correctness. Now, what we see here, and was our hypothesis when you're dealing with environmental bias, is that look at the cyan lines here for each problem decision, or each decision difficulty, sorry. When we introduce the disturbance early on, we're very good at maintaining very similar performance compared to the case where we don't ablate the target. Also, we get fairly good results for introducing that target halfway through the decision-making process. We would expect here to see that when we introduce it late, we get worse performance compared to the baseline. However, it was much worse than we anticipated. So we're investigating this more. Let's see, here we go. So the takeaway message here is that one of the things we see with our ablation results is that disturbance timing really does have an impact, as we anticipated, on the ability of the algorithm to recover. But it recovered nicely in the conditions where we use Cody's algorithm and the environmental bias aspects and some of the other aspects built into that algorithm. However, we do need to develop some adaptive capabilities to address that disturbance later in the decision-making cycle. So this is just starting to get some handle on what does it mean to assess resilience in these types of algorithms. And the problem that we're working on as part of our research is how do we create a general model of the factors that determine the impact of a disturbance on the feedback loops for the collective. And so that's still an open problem. So what we've talked about today are, we've got these algorithms. We have to have these autonomous algorithms that allow us the complex system to function in these real world environments. But we also have to have the ability for the human to influence the collective and have an understanding of what's going on in that collective. And that's where transparency comes into play. But even those two things will not give us a system that really is fully functional and reasonable to deploy in a real world environment. So we also have to consider resilience. So these are the aspects that I've covered today. I want to acknowledge all the contributors to this work, both my current and former students, as well as my external collaborators and all the prior people that have contributed across the scope of the projects and our research sponsors. And I'm happy to take additional questions. And I apologize because we're over.
Not a problem.
I'm going
to applaud on the behalf of everyone. It looks like Dinesh has a question. So Dinesh,
yeah.
I'm going to unmute you. You should be able to unmute yourself, Dinesh.
Thank you, Pratap. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you, Dinesh.
Julie, very nice talk. This is fantastic work. I have two questions. I think you talked about the general notion of human-machine teaming, which is a pretty hot topic, and the science of AI. So, and you use the bees as an example. So I have two questions. And one is that you showed all the wonderful results at the end, compared with Laura Reynolds and Cody's method and result. Is it a driving application? Like, we talk about pure technology development, human machine teaming. Was there a specific task? Are we at the stage, especially you mentioned DARPA offset program or your ONR project? Is there a specific task where how you model the bee, took the inspiration of bee behavior and build this human machine teaming system and eventually show some benefits to an application?
Yes. So Dinesh, I think ultimately you're going to a question that I get quite frequently with regard to collective systems. And, Mark Steinberg likes to say, Mark is a program manager, ONR, for those of you who don't know who he is, likes to say, we've done a decade's worth of research on swarms, and we really haven't progressed that far. Some of my early work in spatial swarms in particular looked at mapping biological inspiration tasks to robotic tasks. And I do think that there are limitations of these systems and their real world applications. I think the best of N algorithm, this searching an environment for a high value target, in the case of Jason's work, he was thinking of a scenario where you need to go out and you need to find potential sites that you need to potentially send human soldiers to investigate. And so you're doing a search of, say, an urban area, for example, to identify an area that you really want to send foot soldiers to. And then you might want to continue that search in, say, a mega city. There's similar analogies to disaster response. If you have, so I'm currently at my condo in Portland, not in Corvallis. And one of the things they constantly are reminding us about, and being an East Coaster, this is new to me, is the big subduction event that could result in the entire city basically being destroyed from an earthquake. And so you can imagine in that type of a scenario, you need to have the swarm searching for perhaps areas where there are a large number of victims. And once you've done that, you want to kind of move to that location and use that as kind of a leapfrog to get to a broader set of areas to search. We also, in the Pacific Northwest, have a lot of forest fires, and they're very different from East Coast forest fires, and very large areas are covered, and you can have hot spots that are literally tens, if not 100 miles apart, because the hot ashes will blow that far. When we had the big wildfires last fall, the closest wildfire to my house in Corvallis was 60 miles away, but there were hot ashes arriving in Corvallis. So again, this is another scenario where you would be able to use a collective for this best of N algorithm, like I described. Some of our other algorithms address other types of tasks. Does that answer your question?
Oh, great. That was fantastic. I think see that. Prasad, do you mind if I ask a follow-on question? I don't want to take this one. So I think two things comes up, this is definitely, I'm a big fan of swarm, with a huge area of emergent behaviors, So even if you take all the application, then two things come up. There's so many behavior in our nature. Bees are one of them. Fish are there. Birds are there. Murmuration are there. And, again, I don't know about biology. I don't know about emergent behavior, how they're different, but why bees? Why not fishes? And why not birds? They are, because you were inspired by bees. Is there any sense of that for certain kind of swarm behavior, bird-like behaviors are better, certain bees are better, certain fishes are better? You see what I'm getting at?
Right. So you're absolutely right. There's different biological inspirations for different types of tasks or different objectives. And it just happens that the best of N algorithm is a colony-based algorithm. And in fact, Cody's algorithm is based not only on bees, but also on some types of ants that exhibit similar capabilities, doing this consensus decision-making process for nest selection. Some of our other algorithms are really focused on, schools of fish. And so I do think that you have to look at the broader spectrum of the biological inspiration. And as you said, we're roboticists or AI experts or human factors experts. We're not biologists. And the key aspect there is to work with the biologists to get some of the key insights. So I think it really kind of depends on your application and doing these mappings between tasks and identifying where they're useful. So if you think about one of my early slides, I talked about the fact that in colonies, the agents tend to go through different types of jobs, which we don't really see with spatial swarms. So that's, I think, a key component of making the systems more useful to humans, and making them heterogeneous. There are a lot of people who do swarms research who are really wedded to that homogeneous system. And I personally don't think that that's going to be successful for a broad range of problems. I think that you have to have this collective capability. Now, going to the emergent aspect, that's a tough question. And as Ben brought up, there's a lot of concern about that. There's a lot of concern within the military, and I have a project for the FAA where we're looking at single operator, multiple drone integration into the national airspace. And that's a huge concern for the FAA as well. As you increase the autonomy of these robots, you are inevitably going to have them have to be able to respond to unexpected events in the environment. The question is, are they decidable algorithms or are they non-decidable algorithms? Are they learning on the fly? I think from a military perspective and an FAA perspective, I think we need to be talking about algorithms that are not learning on the fly, but are perhaps learning information that they bring back that can be vetted and validated before it is embedded into the system. That's not always going to be feasible, I think, in some domains. But I think that is kind of an interim, how do you keep the human kind of in control of some of these decisions? Because there's a lot of ethical questions, of course, safety concerns and things of that nature.
That's great, Julie. Thanks. Let's hope we see swarms in daily life soon. We need to see some big thing. I totally agree with everything you're saying. Let's see if we can make it happen. Thanks again for a great talk, Julie.
You're welcome, Dinesh.
Awesome. So Kulbir has a number of questions here. We probably won't have time to go through all of them, but Kulbir, if you want to ask one of your questions, I'm allowing you to unmute yourself.
Hi, Professor. So I had this question. In one of the graphs that you showed, how did the selection percentage improve with the increase in the number of agents?
Hold on one. Are you talking about these graphs?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So you're asking how the selection accuracy improved as the number of agents increased?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so generally, let's talk about the baseline case here for the easy decision, the solid black line, right? So we see it increasing as we have the number of agents. So as we have more agents, remember that I said we're searching a 500-meter kind of area around the hub. So you have this set area, and when you have more agents, you have more likelihood using a random walk. The agents are doing this random walk, so they're not guaranteed to find the targets. So you have more agents in that same space, you have a higher likelihood of identifying that target. So when we only have 50 agents, we see a lower selection accuracy because they aren't always going to be able to find the highest value target. They're going to find the other targets. And this is not, in computer science term, this is not a complete algorithm, meaning, I'm sorry, it's not an optimal algorithm, meaning that we're not always going to choose the best solution, but we are going to make a decision. So what happens is that the agents reach consensus on a lower value target because there's fewer agents to investigate this whole space, and you have fewer inputs that are getting to this higher value target and bringing that back to the hub. So when you have 500 agents, that's significantly more than 100, and that's why we would see a higher selection accuracy. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yes, Professor. So I just had this last question that I got your point, and then how did the accuracy decrease in case of when we had the disturbance timing as 60%?
Right. So so at 60%, that means that 60% of the agents have reached consensus with regard to the highest value target. So that would be the 90 target. So when we remove that 90 target at that point, 60% of the agents have already committed to that target. So they don't know that that target doesn't exist until they go out and investigate it. So that information has to accumulate in the hub amongst the agents that that target no longer exists. But by the time that you've reached that 60%, those agents are, there's 60% of the agents recruiting the rest of the agents to go investigate that target. And so they're increasing, they've pretty much got momentum as far as agreeing on that target. So it's very hard to change that decision that late in the process.
Okay.
Especially for the intermediate and difficult problems where the target is very far away.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. And that's where we need the adaptive behaviors to address this kind of data down here, where we're introducing the target late for the different problems.
Awesome. I have several of my own questions, but I'm going to keep them for an offline discussion.
Okay.
If there are no more questions, I would like to thank our speaker for an excellent talk. And thank you for everyone for attending. This will be up on the MRC YouTube channel within the next week. And then please keep an eye out for the upcoming Lockheed Martin seminars. Hopefully all of you had a good time and have a good weekend. So thank you very much.